I'm Ed Adams, and this is the Weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. These are the words of The New Colossus, a poem by Emma Lazarus, who's considered to be one of our nation's first prominent Jewish poets. Although this poem was not a physical part of the original construction of the Statue of Liberty, it is now, and it has become in a way the words of the statue herself. The images conjured up by this poem are those that are most familiar when we think of American immigration. Steamships filled to the brim with unfortunate souls from the old country, desperate to leave their former circumstances and make a shot at the American dream. As I talked about before, this image is really only accurate for one specific period in the vast history of American immigration, but it's certainly a powerful one. Last week, we took a broad look at immigration patterns and research techniques for colonial and federal era immigration. But this week, let's take a look at 1840s to early 20th century immigration. The mid to late 1840s were a challenging time in Europe. Although, as I say those words, I can't help but think about all the other challenging times in Europe, so maybe let's just say that there were some unique challenges that drove certain demographics to emigrate to America. In the early 1840s, a potato blight, which had been present in Mexico, had expanded into the eastern United States. By 1845, it had crossed the Atlantic and was impacting the Irish lumper variety of potato, which was the primary staple crop for the vast majority of Irish people. By 1847, Ireland had gone from being a food exporter to being a food importer. Many Irish simply could not afford this more expensive imported food, and they began to starve. Rather than starve to death, which unfortunately many did, others emigrated, predominantly to the United States. Most settled in major metropolitan areas like New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and others. Unlike earlier immigrants from Ireland, these Irish were almost exclusively Catholic, and partially because of the prominence of Protestantism in the United States, these immigrants retained their solid Irish cultural identities well into modern times, including today. Beyond the British Isles, the European continent went through a bit of an upheaval in 1848 with a series of revolutions and uprisings collectively known as the Springtime of Nations. The uprisings were caused by a convergence of a number of things, as they usually are. Industrialization had upended the economy and social order. An increase in awareness of national identity and desire for national independence, and frustrations with aging autocratic rulers all fueled discontent, which erupted at various times mostly throughout Germany, but elsewhere as well. By and large, the uprisings failed to accomplish their goals, so discontent continued. This was the environment that gave us Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto, published also in 1848. Regardless of where individual people fell on the major issues at play, there remained an overall sense of instability in Central Europe. And with the opportunities available in the United States at the time, a large number of German speakers opted to get on ships headed west. These German speakers ended up settling throughout the Midwest, which is why even today you find so many people of German descent there. I taught ROTC briefly at Creighton University in Omaha, and I remember being stunned when I looked at my class roster for that first semester and every single student had a German last name. At the same time, and on through the latter half of the 19th century, Scandinavians came in large numbers. It started with Norwegians, but expanded to Swedes and Danes as well. These Scandinavians were, like many other people, motivated by a number of factors, but population densities in traditionally agricultural nations pushed many to come to the United States, and once things like the Homestead Act of 1862 came into the picture, opportunity seemed to be calling even stronger. Things got into high gear after the Civil War once large portions of the U.S. economy started bouncing back. These immigrants settled mostly in the upper Midwest areas and places like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. The Chinese constitute a smaller but significant block of immigration during this time period. Drawn by the gold rush and the abundance of jobs due to an industrializing economy, as seen in projects like the Transcontinental Railroad, these immigrants found themselves in many places throughout the United States early on, but mostly ended up settling in California and the Pacific Northwest. One key exception to this is the notable New York City Chinatown, which started to form in the late 1850s. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevented the immigration of most Chinese nationals, was passed in 1882, which likely changed the trajectory of this particular migration pattern. Moving into the latter part of the century and on into the early 20th century, things changed slightly in terms of demographics. Irish, Germans, and Scandinavians all continued to immigrate in large numbers, but they were eclipsed by new nationalities that had not really immigrated to the United States in large numbers before: Italians and Eastern Europeans. Most of the Italians who came during this time period came from the south of Italy, including Sicily. The timing and demographics of this wave of immigration were largely as a result of the long, painful process of the unification of Italy. Once unification was achieved, the economy of the new nation was thrown into turmoil, and the economy of the South struggled to keep up with the industrial North and Northwest. To make things worse, the debts racked up by Piedmont in the North during the period before unification led to higher taxes throughout the new nation. So, with little economic opportunity and a crushing tax burden, many Southern Italians decided to beat feet to America. Much like the potato famine Irish, the Italians settled predominantly in urban areas like New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, and so on. Eastern Europeans also came in incredible numbers through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, I think typically when we think of Eastern Europeans today, we mostly think of maybe Poland and Russia, and they certainly came in large numbers, but this wave saw massive immigration from throughout Eastern Europe, from Lithuania down to the Balkans. Now, 1880 to 1920 is a pretty long time frame, and during this time millions and millions of Eastern Europeans arrived and did so for a wide variety of reasons. Almost 3 million of these immigrants were Jewish, largely fleeing pogroms and persecution in the Russian Empire. For everyone else, motivation varied based on nationality and when they immigrated, but a simple explanation would be to say that while economies throughout Europe were rapidly changing, industrialization was slow to catch on in the East. Historically poor regions became poorer, and by the end of this period, after the October Revolution of 1917, if you had the means and opportunity to leave, you left. Overwhelmingly, immigrants from the east of Europe settled in metropolitan areas. New York City and Chicago were major centers, with New York's Lower East Side ending up absolutely dominated by Jews and various Slavic peoples. But that's just the fun stuff to know, I suppose. You're really here because you want to know more about researching these people. Something I should have said in the last episode but didn't, and it's really fundamental, is don't start worrying about studying the immigration facts of your ancestor until you've learned everything you can learn about their life in the United States. If, as you're going back through time through your family tree, you find that great-grandfather on the census and you're excited to see that he was born in Italy, that's fantastic. It's exciting to see things like that, but don't just jump headlong into immigration research just yet. Remember, if you've just met this guy in the census, he's still a stranger to you. Immigration research becomes much easier if you're researching a subject that you know well. Build out their American fan club, follow them all the way to the grave in the United States, and then go back and work on immigration records. This will help you better target the individual, since there's more than one Antonio Moretti who immigrated to the United States during this period. And I don't mean that there were several, I mean that when I look at the Ellis Island records, I find 240 of them. If all you know about your Antonio is when he was born and that he lived in Manhattan in 1940, good luck. But now that I've said that, and I've used the magic word and mentioned Ellis Island, let's talk about it. First off, it didn't open until 1892, so if your ancestor came earlier, they didn't come through Ellis. If they came through New York at all, it would have more likely been through Castle Garden, which opened up in 1855 and closed in 1890. If your ancestor landed in New York in that narrow window between Castle Garden and Ellis Island, they would have arrived in the barge office, down on the southern tip of Manhattan near Battery Park. This is something to think about as you're planning your research for your immigrant ancestor. If they came before 1890, you should be looking at the Castle Garden records, After 1890, Ellis Island records, because most of the barge office records were rolled up into the records kept at Ellis. Ellis Island is the subject of a number of long-standing, very strongly believed myths that it's helpful to deal with if you want to be able to do effective research. The first one is so widely believed that I think only historians and genealogists know that it's a myth. There's probably some of them who even believe it, unfortunately. This is the myth of the name change. The myth goes something like this. Your great-grandfather, Grzegorz Brzezinskiewicz, was standing in line at Ellis Island after having endured a weeks-long journey across the treacherous waters of the Atlantic, only to be greeted by an English-speaking processing clerk who asked your great-grandfather what his name was. After being unable to decipher what was being said, the clerk just writes down Gary Boscovich because it's close and nobody deserves that many letters in their name anyhow. There's a couple of problems with this picture that many people have of how things worked at Ellis Island. The first problem with this picture is the idea that names of immigrants were written down at Ellis Island. In the vast majority of cases, no one at Ellis Island wrote down an immigrant's name. The names were already on the passenger lists that had been filled out at the port of departure. So if your ancestor shows up with an unexpectedly anglicized or simplified name, it wasn't some administrator at Ellis Island who did it. It's far more likely that your ancestor decided to take on the name themselves. In most of the cases that I have come across, this Americanization of names occurs after their entry into America, not before or during. There are some additional issues with this myth, though. Among the workforce at Ellis Island were speakers of about 24 different languages. It would have been impossible to deal with that many non-English speaking immigrants in any kind of effective way without this capability. So the chances are that any immigrant agent who actually spoke to your ancestor spoke a language that your ancestor could understand. The second big myth is that during the years that Ellis Island was open, all immigrants came through Ellis Island. While most certainly did come through Ellis Island, there were other ports of entry in Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, San Francisco, and New Orleans. So if you can't find your ancestor in the Ellis Island records, try looking at records for these ports too. There are several other common myths about Ellis Island, but they have less of an impact on your ability to research your ancestor. But no, it was not a torturous experience where millions of hopefuls were turned around, families spent days waiting to be processed, and disease ran rampant. The processing occurred reasonably quickly. It was remarkably clean and well run, and although probably over 200,000 immigrants were turned back, that's out of over 12 million. So once you arrived in New York, you had a pretty good shot. Now, enough on the immigrants and where they arrived. Let's talk about where to look to find more about them. Again, your first go-to should be your American records. Censuses, draft cards, and the like will have a good bit of information that can help you zero in on the things you really want to find. When looking at the censuses, 1950 and 1940 are only partially helpful. You'll see a birthplace and whether your ancestor was naturalized or not, which can clue you in as to whether there might be naturalization papers to find, but it doesn't tell you anything else. The 1900 to 1930 censuses will tell you what year your immigrant ancestor arrived. Write that down because it will be important going forward. Looking at other American sources that might have specific birth information like draft cards, death certificates, and some others, make sure to see if it lists an actual town of birth. This, paired with your ancestor's name and immigration year, will make it much easier to find them. If you can't find specific town information, though, don't worry, it can still be done. If censuses indicate that your ancestor was naturalized, I would first look for their naturalization records. They have loads of great detail that will oftentimes make finding the passenger list information a walk in the park. Naturalization records, which are readily available at most of the big genealogy sites, including the Free Family Search, will have street address, birth date, usually a specific birth location, their ethnicity, the name of the ship they arrived on and when, and importantly, the name that they immigrated under. When I was researching Mike Coburn and found his naturalization records, I found that his name on the passenger list was going to be Nikita Kaverda, not Mike Coburn. That will save you hours of frustration. They also have information about their spouse's nativity, which can be really useful, as many female immigrants never naturalized. All this information can be used to cross-reference as you look for your next target source, passenger lists. Again, these can be found just about anywhere. Just go to the catalog on your favorite genealogy website and search passenger lists. Keep in mind that the indexing for passenger lists is okay. I've many times seen slight mistakes and major goof-ups where the transcribed name on the digital index is either wrong by a few characters or is laughable. This is where the Search Tips episode can really help you. Use your spelling variations and your wildcards to dig in all the right places. One tool that I've found quite useful is Stephen Morse's one-step web pages. I don't really know much about him, but Mr. Morse is a saint. He has loads of tools to help you find a lot of things, really, but several focused on tackling your immigrant ancestor questions. He has custom-built search forms that let you abandon name searching entirely and look at everyone who arrived in a certain year on a certain ship of a certain ethnicity. Yes, that may end up being 100 people or so, but you can quickly scan through that and look for names that look familiar to the one that you're looking for. His records are then usually linked to either Ancestry or Family Search, or in most cases have options for both. If you've never used his website before, please don't let your head hit the pillow tonight without at least having a look around. Link is in the episode description. If you still have trouble finding your immigrant ancestors' passenger list information, back out a bit and look at their fan club again. Did he or she have any brothers or sisters, aunts or uncles? Did their parents come over earlier or later? Is there a name that routinely shows up on things like the witness of his or her wedding is also a few doors down in the census? Try to look these people up. Chances are you're bound to find at least one of them in the passenger lists. Then, use what you find out about them to hone in on your target ancestor. I was able to do this once by noticing that one of my research subjects lived briefly with her half-brother in New York City. There were several immigrants of the same name who arrived the year that she arrived, and I didn't know which one was her. Once I researched him, though, I found only one of them showed the same village as her home, and wouldn't you know, she reported the same New York City address where they were living later as her destination. I feel like I could go on, but I don't want a 20-minute episode, and I'd rather not do 3 episodes in a row on immigration, so we'll land the plane here. Immigration research is extremely rewarding and challenging in a fun way. There's so much to learn, and that's one of the things that keeps me coming back to genealogy. I've been doing this for a very long time, but I would think of myself as a fraud if I said that I was an expert. There's so much I still have to learn, but that's a big part of the fun for me. I hope you've learned something from the last 2 episodes, and when you finally find where that ancestor came from, I'd love for you to reach out to me and tell me about it on Twitter, @thewgtpod. As always, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.